Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of F.R. Hansen's The Breakdown of Capitalism, A History of the Idea in Western Marxism, 1883 to 1983. Chapter 6 of this book is titled, come on, get down there. The anti-orthodox response to crash and recovery, superstructural models of collapse, with the headings Anti-orthodoxy and the rejection of economic primacy, critical theory, Anti-orthodox and the rejection of historical specificity, French structuralism, Neo-orthodox continuations, the submerged tradition. So let's see if I can get to the right page. I'm going to guess 105. Damn it. It was close, but no cigar. Okay, here we are. So let's go. The anti-orthodox response to crash and recovery. Superstructural models of collapse. Quote, liberation from capitalism is liberation from the rule of the economy. When the autonomy of the economy is ended, quote, political economy, end quote, as an independent science also disappears. End quote. Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. Quote, are we always within the capitalist mode of production? Are we within a later mode? Are we within a mode of production at all? And have we ever even been in one? End quote. Baudrillard, The Mirror of Production. In 1930, soon after Pollock's work was published, Horkheimer replaced Grunberg as the director of the Frankfurt Institute, now well established as the center of serious social inquiry in Europe. Horkheimer was a philosopher by training and a rigorous critic of the German Social Democratic Party and the German Communist Party. Horkheimer's efforts as the new director were supported by Herbert Marcuse and Theodor Adorno, central members of the Institute who shared Horkheimer's political and theoretical views. The development of Marxist theory in the West over the next 40 years was largely the work of intellectuals who, like the central members of the Institute, had little in common with orthodox Marxists or the neo-orthodox theorists who had constructed the dominant forms of breakdown theory in the period before 1930. The failure of the proletarian revolution in Germany and the rise of fascism in Europe were formative political experiences for the theorists associated with the Frankfurt Institute in Germany and the academies in France. Unlike the generation of Lenin and Luxemburg, which had been marked by internationalism and activism, the anti-orthodox Marxists of Frankfurt and Paris were characterized by parochialism and intellectual isolation, and by their uneasy, sporadic, and indirect contact with worker organizations, with what may well have been a glance back to the theoretical failures forced by proximity to particularistic political activity. Horkheimer once wrote, quote, on the identity of theory and practice is not to be forgotten their difference, end quote. Horkheimer, quoted in Russell Jacoby's article, Marxism and the Critical School, published in Theory and Society, 1974. See also Horkheimer's essays in Critical Theory Selected Essays, translated by M. O'Connell et al. In 1972, particularly the article Traditional and Critical Theory, which is on this channel, where Horkheimer attempts to define critical theory, the basis of West German anti-orthodox Marxism. And footnote. The anti-orthodox theorists were trained as philosophers, with their immediate attention turned away from economics and politics towards a discourse on method and aesthetics. Their interest in non-Marxist ideas was intense rather than superficial, and their relationship to Marx was critical rather than committed. Their Marxism was spoken in a code that served the dual purpose of eluding political censorship and avoiding the positivistic terminology of the orthodox and neo-orthodox schools. Their analyses of capitalism appeared in works which were both betrayals and affirmations of Marx's most fundamental ideas. In the writings of the anti-orthodox theorist, the concepts of Marx's capital were mediated by a series of perceptions and new theoretical elaborations that pressed Marx's thought to its most extreme, but nonetheless logical conclusions. As Adorno said, their work did not represent, quote, the replacement of one theory by another, but the imminent drawing out of certain of the fundamentals of the materialist dialectic, end quote. Adorno. Also quoted in Jacobi. The result of their work... Shit. Christ on a cracker. 1 second. Okay. The result of their work was a fundamental shift in the nature of Marxist theory and consequently in the formation of concepts of breakdown after 1930. This theoretical shift was characterized by a pessimism about the possibility of an end to capitalism and a certain apprehension about what might follow if it should collapse. In the age of the complete consolidation of capitalism, the rise of fascism, and the profound isolation of Western Marxists from the communist parties of Europe and the Soviet Union, economic breakdown seemed unlikely and revolution seemed impossible. Within this context, of new and less favorable conditions, Marx's thought was recast to accommodate a world that now seemed to exist in an inverted state. Theories of breakdown emerged in a superstructural form and contained visions of the future that were less concrete, but much more awesome than the visions found in the earlier forms. New section: Anti-orthodoxy and the rejection of economic primacy. In 1941, Pollock published an essay on state capitalism which assumed a more thoroughgoing anti-orthodox position than his earlier writings. Pollock describes state capitalism as the emerging dominant mode of production. Before World War I, Pollock finds private capitalism, guided by the market mechanism, was still functional, but monopolization and the dislocation of the world market, combined with the market's failure to regulate the increasingly destructive business cycle, weakened private capitalism after the war. Footnote: see Pollock, Capitalism, Its Possibilities and Limitations, and that's available on this channel. And footnote: Europe now faces, quote, transitional processes transforming private capitalism into state capitalism, end quote. Pollock. In the United States economy marked by high unemployment and a dysfunctional market system, quote, analogous developments may reach a point where no measure short of a reorganization of the economic system can prevent the complete disintegration of the social structure, end quote. Pollock. State capitalism, long visible in Europe and America, emerged in full form in Nazi Germany. Under state capitalism, production facilities are privately owned, but production and distribution are controlled by the state. The state is an instrument of a ruling class composed of management, the state bureaucracy, and the military and party bureaucracies. Planning takes place on a national scale, with individual profit interests subordinated to the general interests of the group. Production is rationalized, prices are administered, and the business cycle is brought to an end through government control over the economy. With state capitalism, Pollock argues, economic primacy no longer exists. Quote, the replacement of the economic means by political means as the last guarantee of the reproduction of economic life changes the character of the whole historic period. It signifies the transition from a predominantly economic to an essentially political era. End quote. Pollock. The economic phenomena which produce crises under private capitalism become, quote, mere problems of administration, end quote. Economic theories of breakdown are misplaced under state capitalism. Pollock is, quote, unable to discover any inherent economic forces, quote, economic laws of the old or new type, which could prevent the functioning of state capitalism, end quote. Pollock. State capitalism, however, cannot survive in a peacetime economy. War or war preparations are necessary to avoid unemployment and overproduction without raising the standard of living to levels which breed the potential for politicization and revolution. The threat of collapse, however, arises from the political and military sphere, not from the economy. With Pollock and the concept of state capitalism, the relationship between structure and superstructure in crises and collapse was reversed. Economic policy was transformed into political primacy. Apart from Pollock's studies of state capitalism and technology, the concerns of the anti-orthodox Marxists in the post-war years rested primarily with the study of consciousness, ideology, and the linguistic forces that coincided with the advance of world capitalism and seeming suspension of overt class conflict in the West. Drawing from non-Marxist sources and from the resurgence of Hegelian thought stimulated by the appearance of Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and Marx's Paris manuscripts, published for the first time in 1932, the Institute members began a series of studies of ideology and aesthetics in advanced capitalist society and a long commentary on Marx and methodology. These projects were marked by a new emphasis on the capitalist superstructure as the force that holds the power to threaten or reinforce the economic order through ideological and linguistic control. Theories of the breakdown of capitalism competed with theories of the perpetuation of capitalism, and with a series of surrogate concepts designed to explain the absence of crises rather than their presence. According to the Institute studies, the false consciousness that blinds the working class to the working class's own interest is not only an expression of capitalist society in an advanced and decayed state of development, but also an expression of that society's successful attempt to reorganize itself in a way that mitigates and forestalls its self-destructive capacities. Throughout the works of the Institute members, the general statements on contradiction found in Marx's Capital are largely displaced by a notion of history based on repetition and difference. The intellectual movement entailed resembles the open dialectic found in Marx's discussion of profit rates, but far exceeds its pessimism and minimizes its implications for the possibility of genuine change and disruption. These studies are reinforced by a second-order discourse on Marx that is critical, anti-positivist, anti-productivist, and abstract. This discourse is directed toward an attempt to revitalize the long-neglected part of Marx's thought that is conducive to an explanation of the ideological consolidation of the bourgeois order. The most complete and fruitful critique and extension of Marx's thought to arise from the Institute appears in the works of Jürgen Habermas, one of the Institute's post-immigration members and one of the most influential Marxist theorists in West Germany today. Habermas's Marxism, if it exists at all, is to say that Habermas is a Marxist at all is very dubious. But this book was written in the 1980s. And also, there's always important to keep in mind, there's the other second generation of the Frankfurt School, which would be characterized by Hans-Jürgen Kroll, Reichelt and Backhaus, Agnoli, Schmidt, but also Knecht. What's the other guy's name? Can't think of it right now. Kluge. Anyway, moving on. With Habermas, the origins, meanings, and consequences of anti-orthodox interpretations of breakdown theory are most clearly revealed. Habermas was a student in Frankfurt in the 1950s after the Institute returned to Germany from its exile in America. Habermas taught at the Institute from 1964 to 1970 and continued to identify with the critical theory school associated with the Institute despite his move to the Max Planck Institute in 1970, where he served as director. Habermas continues the critique of Marx that had been initiated by Horkheimer and Adorno in their contention that Marx relied on assumptions involving the ontological centrality of labor and a positivistic understanding of the social sciences. But Habermas remains in fundamental agreement with Marx's critique of classical political economy and with his assessment of the origins and conditions of the capitalist mode of production. Habermas returns to these points in Marx's thought for the foundations for his theory of capitalist development. Marx was correct, Habermas contends, in his analysis of the relationship between the economic structure and the political superstructure under liberal capitalism, and in his analysis of the ideology of equal exchange as the mechanism that conceals the actual source of domination. Habermas also agrees with Marx's claim that the primary characteristic of liberal capitalism is its ability to legitimize domination through the market, rather than through the traditional institutional forms that provided justification for political domination and economic stratification in pre-capitalist societies. With the advent of capitalism, Habermas argues, the property order changed from a political relation to a production relation, with the economic sphere legitimized by its own system of exchange. Under liberal capitalism, he claims, quote, the institutional framework of society is only immediately political and immediately economic. The bourgeois constitutional state as, quote, superstructure, end quote, end quote. Habermas. Habermas. The quote from Habermas is from Towards a Rational Society, Student Protests, Science and Politics, translated by J. Shapiro in 1970. But Habermas shares with the great majority of Western Marxist scholars in the perception of a changed capitalist order, and locates the origins of that change at the turn of the century, as did Bernstein, Lenin, and Horkheimer before Habermas. Like the earlier anti-orthodox theorists, Habermas determines that the change was sufficiently dramatic to require a radical reformulation of Marxist thought, one that would redefine the relationship between structure and superstructure. Habermas specifies two major, quote, tendencies that mark the, quote, advanced capitalism that has come to dominate the world economy since Marx's Capital was written. With the Neo-orthodox theorist, Habermas identifies a tendency towards an increase in the degree of state intervention in the economy successfully introduced to reduce economic instability. With the earlier anti-orthodox Marxist, he identifies a second tendency towards an increase in the role of the sciences in the forces of production. As Habermas interprets it, the first tendency indicates that Marx's analysis of the relationship between the economic structure and the political superstructure is no longer accurate. The second tendency indicates that Marx's labor theory of value is no longer applicable, and that his concept of ideology is no longer sufficient to describe conditions under advanced capitalism. The open dialectic of Marx's Capital is reproduced in an exaggerated form in Habermas's thought, and ultimately turned back against itself as Marx gradually disappears from the frame of reference. Habermas rejects the neo-orthodox analysis of a politicized economy found in Lenin's imperialism and in Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capitalism. The economy, Habermas argues, has not been, quote, politicized, but, quote, repoliticized, end quote, to a degree that makes its role in the social order comparable to the economies of the pre-capitalist world, and undermines any comparison with the 19th century. The relationship between structure and superstructure under advanced capitalism more closely resembles the relationship as it appeared under feudalism than under liberal capitalism. Habermas asserts that, quote, if society no longer, quote, autonomously, end quote, perpetuates itself through the self-regulation of a sphere, proceeding and lying at the basis of the state, then society and the state are no longer in the relationship that Marxian theory had defined as base and superstructure, end quote. Habermas. In Towards a Rational Society. Any theory that assumes the primacy of economics is, quote, inapplicable when the, quote, base has to be comprehended as in itself a function of governmental activity and political conflicts, end quote. Habermas. Towards a Rational Society. This perception of a reversal in the relationship between structure and superstructure bears far-reaching consequences for breakdown theory in Habermas's works. State intervention in the economy began, Habermas determines, quote, as a defense mechanism against dysfunctional tendencies which threaten the system that capitalism generates when left to itself, end quote. These dysfunctional tendencies stem from recurring crises and from the collapse of the ideology of equal exchange. In order to maintain an economic system based on the private ownership and utilization of capital, the economy, which had functioned as an autonomous force in 19th century capitalism, was repoliticized and the need for direct political legitimation reappeared, with the relationship between the economy and the political system now reversed. The political system is directed toward the negative purpose of minimizing the occurrence and impact of economic dysfunctions. And, quote, government activity is restricted to administratively soluble technical problems. Unquote. Wait, I don't know if that's a quote or... Yeah, let me repeat that. With the relationship between the economy and the political system now reversed, the political system is directed toward the negative purpose of minimizing the occurrence and impact of economic dysfunctions. And, quote, government activity is restricted to administratively soluble technical problems, end quote, rather than the realization of societal goals. The consequences of this restriction, Habermas finds, is the, quote, abolition of politics through administration, end quote, the depoliticization of the masses and the transformation of science and technology into the basis of a new ideological order. Crises still arise in the economic realm, but the real threat to the perpetuation of capitalism arises in the political sphere and involves the potential for a breakdown in the ability to legitimize the governments vested with the responsibility of buttressing a flawed social order. According to Habermas, crisis and breakdown in the economic realm are displaced by disruptions in the political realm. Because the, quote, dysfunctional side effects of the economic process could less and less be segmented from one another and neutralized in relation to the state, end quote, there developed, quote, a general responsibility of the state for deficiencies, and a presumption of its competence to eliminate them, end quote. Habermas, Communication and Evolution of Society, translated by T. McCarthy, 1979. Habermas argues that crises in the political realm, quote, can be averted only if the state can credibly present itself as a social welfare state, which intercepts the dysfunctional side effects of the economic process and renders them harmless for the individual, ... end quote. Habermas, Communication and Evolution of Society. Economic contradictions and crises and the class conflict associated with them are increasingly displaced by crises in the political realm. This occurs when the state administration necessarily fails to fulfill the expectations and demands of competing groups, and the ideological forms fail to regenerate motivation. Quote, today the state has to fulfill functions that can be neither explained with reference to prerequisites of the continued existence of the mode of production, nor derived from the imminent movement of capital. This movement is no longer realized through a market mechanism that can be comprehended in the theory of value, but is a result of the still effective economic driving forces and a political counter-control in which a displacement of the relations of production finds expression, end quote. Habermas, Legitimation Crisis. Under advanced capitalism, Habermas continues, the problem of economic breakdown is administratively processed, but not administratively controlled in a way that ensures the long-term perpetuation of the system. Perpetuation is guaranteed only so long as the substitute relation between economic surplus, political efficacy, and social motivation is maintained. If the legitimacy of the system is to continue unchallenged, Habermas argues, the dysfunctions arising from interruptions in accumulation and a pattern of unequal distribution must be corrected through governmental policies that ensure growth, meet minimal collective needs, and provide an acceptable standard of living. If these corrections are not possible, a crisis will occur and must be diffused or concealed. When a crisis generated in the economic realm cannot be forestalled, the state, quote, no longer allows the crisis to come to light in an immediately economic form, end quote, but shifts into the cultural and social realms. Economic crises that cannot be controlled are, quote, shifted towards sectors and zones marginal to the system, end quote. So that, quote, other conflicts are brought into play to replace the central conflict, end quote. Habermas. Given this state of affairs, quote, the real, indeed the only question is whether economic problems will become of such a magnitude that this model thriving on, quote, small crises, end quote, will be unable to function any longer and, consequently, precipitate a crisis of classic dimensions. It remains to be seen how this is all going to end, but on the other hand, in view of the strong probabilities of a fatal outcome, I do not think we could lightheartedly wish or hope for a, quote, great crisis, end quote. End quote. Habermas. Telos interview. 1979. The second tendency of advanced capitalism, the tendency towards the increased role of science in the forces of production, is related to the first tendency in that it contributes to this process of displacement and concealment. According to Habermas, the displacement of economic conflict by political conflict, and the subsequent, quote, abolition of politics through administration, end quote, induced by the level of technological achievement in the mode of production, shifts the basis of ideology to technology and science. Technology and science then, quote, take on the function of legitimizing political power, end quote. Habermas, Towards a Rational Society. Habermas claims that the ideology of equal exchange collapsed at the end of liberal capitalism. The need for state intervention includes a need to, quote, secure the private form of capital utilization and bind the masses, and, quote, let me reread that. The need for state intervention includes a need to, quote, secure the private form of capital utilization and bind the masses' loyalty to this form, end quote. Habermas, through the ideological installation of science and technology as the new determinants of social advancement. Marx's labor theory of value, Habermas argues, is inapplicable in a society where technical innovation shifts the focus away from labor and towards capital investment. Moreover, Habermas finds that Marx's concept of ideology is inappropriate in a society where science, as the critique of ideology, becomes the basis of a new ideological system which posits instrumental action as the total realm of human interaction and technical rationality as the total realm of human rationality. Habermas concludes that the, quote, laws of the economic system are no longer identical to those analyzed by Marx, end quote. Habermas, Telos interview. The economic system of advanced capitalism is a system, quote, about which we still have not developed adequate analyses. It is a very complex system which brings about the interaction between economy, politics, and culture. We might say that we would need a functional equivalent of Marx's theory, but we do not have it. As for the internal mechanisms of the economic system, pure and simple, one can say that today they are relatively transparent and that there is not further need for a critique of ideology, end quote. Habermas, Telos interview. The, quote, functional equivalent, end quote, that Habermas initiates in his account of capitalist development provides a form for the use of empirical data, but remains thoroughly anti-positivist. The methodological and epistemological positions assumed by Habermas's critical theory preclude the possibility of linking his work to the revisionist orthodox or neo-orthodox schools, all of which worked within the confines of the positivistic split between empirical and general analysis. Moreover, Habermas's reversal of the structure-superstructure relationship removes him from any association with the neo-orthodox theorist who recognized the, quote, new capitalism, end quote, but not its full implications for Marxist thought and breakdown theory. Habermas's writings can only be situated within the discourse of the open dialectic found in the negative movements of Marx's Capital. In the discussion of profit rates and the anti-orthodox movement, they first recognized that submerged voice in the works of Marx. The substance of Habermas's analysis and the determination with which he distances his analysis from that of Marx combined to create a critical point of juncture between the works of Veblen and Habermas. Like Veblen, Habermas roots his reformulation of the relationship between structure and superstructure in the late 19th century movement towards mechanization and concentration. Veblen's description of a return to, quote, dynastic government resonates with Habermas's depiction of, quote, repoliticization, end quote, a movement towards direct political legitimation fueled by militaristic ideologies and subsequently dominated by technical rationality in depoliticized administrative sectors. The emphasis on superstructure in the works of Veblen and Habermas leads both theorists to extensive considerations of ideological and communicative forms. Habermas's studies of distorted communication are well known, as are Veblen's writings on symbolic systems. Footnote. See, for example, Habermas's Toward a Theory of Communicative Competence, published in Inquiry in 1970, and Thorstein Veblen's The Theory of the Leisure Class and Economic Study of Institutions, published in 1953. End footnote. In both cases, Veblen and Habermas once again dissociate their work from its Marxist origin. Epistemologically, Veblen distances himself from Marx by exaggerating the Hegelian content of Capital. Similarly, Habermas's early critique of Marx rests on a reading of Marx's concept of labor that emphasizes its Hegelian origins. The latter critique privileges the positivist tendencies of Marx's economic analysis. But like Veblen, the Hegelian element that Habermas exaggerates in Marx's thought reappears in his own. In his work on communicative competence, Habermas pushes dangerously close to a Hegelian notion of an ideal speech situation in which full recovery from distorted communication is assumed to be possible. Here Habermas moves much closer to Hegel than Marx ever ventured. In Habermas's works, however, the open dialectic is given an exaggerated form that eventually undermines the attempt to provide a, quote, functional equivalent, end quote, to Marx's theory of capitalist development. In his flight from positivism, Habermas overstates the positivist content of Marx's Capital and too readily rejects portions of that text that serve as a corrective against idealist interpretations of social phenomena. Consequently, Habermas's attempt to reformulate breakdown theory in superstructural terms is infused with concerns that threaten to destroy the specificity of the theory and its critical relationship to the capitalist order. With the breakdown redefined as the collapse of all forms of intellectual life, Habermas retreats into a political pacifism that defeats the critical intent of Habermas's work and reproduces a form of absolute idealism that he explicitly rejects at other points in his writings. The discourse of the open dialectic quickly becomes a discourse without an object and without an objective. In many ways, Habermas's simultaneous rejection of the positivist and idealist content of Marx's Capital, which exists for Habermas in an exaggerated form, creates in Habermas's thought a series of gaps that cannot be filled. New section, Anti-orthodoxy and the rejection of historical specificity, French structuralism. Habermas's theory of breakdown represents the culmination of a fundamental shift in Marxist thought in 20th century West Germany. This shift occurred simultaneously in the academies of France, but with different consequences for the development of breakdown theory. Henri Lefebvre, the most important theoretician to work within the ranks of the French Communist Party of the 1930s, translated Marx's 1844 manuscripts as soon as they were released from Moscow and immediately wrote the book Dialectical Materialism, the first full-length study to appear under their influence. Shortly afterwards, Alexandre Kojève's lectures on Hegel began to attract the generation of French intellectuals who became the forefront of anti-orthodox Marxism in France: Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Simone de Beauvoir. Among these, Sartre achieved the most influential position, and his existentialist Marxism dominated French socialist thought for the next decade. Discussions of the economic concepts of Marx's Capital or of the political problems outlined in Lenin's Imperialism were lost in a flood of works on aesthetics and methodology. The existentialist and humanist Marxism that evolved from the works of Sartre eventually collided with the structuralist perspectives emerging from works in literary criticism and anthropology. A debate between humanist Marxists, best represented by Lucien Sèvres, and the structuralist Marxists, best represented by Maurice Godelier, developed around the issue of the compatibility of two competing methodologies. Sorry, I had to get to the footnotes. Footnote: see Sèvres' article, The Structural Method and the Dialectical Method, and Reply to Maurice Godelier, published in International Journal of Sociology, 1972. See Godelier's Comments on the Concepts of Structure and Contradiction, and the article Dialectical Logic and the Analysis of Structures, a reply to Lucien Sèvres, and footnote. The humanist emphasis on history and the role of historical agents, and the structuralist emphasis on synchronic forms and economic primacy, found their fullest expression in interpretations of Marx's theory of the transition of modes of production. The concern with methodology, the original point of the debate and the central focus of French Marxist thought up to this point, once again merged with substantive issues related to the problems of economic transformations, crises, and breakdown. The merging of these interpretive, methodological, and substantive issues is nowhere more complete than in the works of Louis Althusser, the most formidable Marxist theorist of post-war France. Throughout his works, Althusser's central concern has been with the concept of ideology and its relationship to an economy which is determinative, quote, in the last instance, unquote. Although Althusser has distanced himself from other structuralist Marxists, he nonetheless joins forces with figures like Godelier in his insistence on the validity of the concepts of economic primacy and structural determinacy. The concept of breakdown that emerges from Althusser's works and the works of his collaborators is the most rigorous and yet the most elusive to appear in the post-war period. Footnote: Althusser's most important works are the book For Marx, 1965, Reading Capital, 1965, Lenin and Philosophy and Other Essays, a collection of articles written between 1964 and 1970. For a short, simple account of Althusser's theoretical work, see Kalinikos's Althusser's Marxism, published in 1976. See also M. Glucksmann's book, Structuralist Analysis in Contemporary Social Thought, a comparison of the theories of Claude Lévi-Strauss and Louis Althusser, published in 1974. End footnote. Althusser's analysis of capitalism and his conception of economic primacy rest on his idea of a structure in dominance, or the idea of an economic structure as a set of contradictions that determines the force with which other aspects of the social order control social development. Because of its position as a structure that determines the dominant forces in social development, At any point in time, the economy is, according to Althusser, determinative in the last instance. Superstructural forces are not epiphenomena of the economy, but in unity with it, it may be of superior immediate force, even though that force is itself both a product and a condition of the economy. Footnote. See Althusser's For Marx. Although Althusser does not directly address the problem of economic collapse, Etienne Balibar, in a lengthy essay published in Louis Althusser's Reading Capital, attempts to extend Althusser's concepts of economic primacy and structural determinacy to the problem of breakdown. Focusing on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital, Balibar treats the falling rate of profit as the necessary process of an unexplained end, and as an effect of the economic structure rather than an empirically and progressively realized law of development resulting in a certain defined event. Rejecting those aspects of the law of the falling rate of profit that appear to be, quote, empiricist and mechanistic in character, end quote, Balibar claims that the law of the falling rate of profit does not indicate the breakdown of capitalism, but a potentially endless repetition of crises and recoveries. Footnote. See Balibar on the basic concepts of historical materialism in Althusser's Reading Capital. End footnote. Quote, thus, Balibar writes, quote, the only intrinsic result of the contradiction, which is completely immanent to the economic structure, does not tend towards the supersession of the contradiction, but to the perpetuation of its conditions, end quote. Balibar. On the basic concepts of historical materialism. The law of the falling rate of profit is the theoretical elaboration of the cycle of capitalist development, not of its impending collapse. The tendency of capitalism that expresses its contradictions as a mode of production never reach a climactic point or limit. The potential for collapse, Balibar contends, does not arise from the falling rate of profit, but from the coincidence of this condition with class conflict, so that the repetition of economic crises, quote, can be the occasion for a revolutionary transformation of the structure of production, end quote. Balibar. In this way, Balibar combines the discourse of the open dialectic from the discussion of profit rates in Volume 3 of Marx's Capital, with its notion of repetition and the potential perpetuation of contradiction, with the idea of proletarian revolution found in the general statements on contradiction in Volume 1. But Balibar's contention that the falling rate of profit creates a cyclical pattern of economic development is theoretically unsupported. Moreover, Balibar's conceptualization of crises as, quote, an occasion, end quote, for revolutionary activity remains undeveloped. There is no attempt to specify the conditions for revolution. Althusser does not take up the issue of breakdown or proletarian revolution, but submerges both in Althusser's discussion of the state and ideology in advanced capitalist society. Althusser's critique of capitalism and the ideological systems that support its perpetuation is initially derived from Marx's concept of fetishism and false consciousness. Like Lukács and Korsch, Althusser reacts against the idea of ideology as an illusion, an idea that was widespread during the era of the Second International. In an attempt to return to Marx's concept of ideology as a necessary illusion, Althusser emphasizes the objective role of ideology in social formations. In doing so, Althusser moves away from the historical analyses of fetishism and ideology found in Marx's Capital and turns to the concept of ideology as a necessary illusion in all societies, apart from the specific contradictions of capitalism and the economic grounding of Marx's analyses. In Marx's Capital, the ideological superstructure is related to a variable economic structure. In the works of Althusser, ideology is a consequence of an invariant social structure, the universal need for social cohesion. Unlike Lenin and Luxemburg, whose interest in ideology remained tied to their analyses of the survival of capitalism and the role of the working class, Althusser's interest in ideology lies in general theories of consciousness formation, the relationship between the theory of capitalist development and the study of ideologies, a relationship implicitly affirmed in Marx's discussions of critique and fetishism, becomes obscure in Althusser's writings. With the works of Habermas and Althusser, the leading Western Marxist theorists of the post-war era, the concept of breakdown is re-established, but in a form radically different from that which appeared in the writings of Bernstein and Kautsky, or in the works of Lenin and Luxemburg, to the extent that the orthodox and neo-orthodox theorists recognized the interaction between structure and superstructure. Their recognition was motivated by their attempts to introduce the motor role of class struggle into a theory of breakdown which seemed to have lost its validity under the conditions of monopoly capitalism and imperialism. Lenin turned to the problem of consciousness in search of a theoretical guide to the development of a class struggle that would compensate for capitalism's new invulnerability to problems of realization and accumulation. With Habermas and Althusser, however, the roles of structure and superstructure are not defined by perceptions of economic problems or by political requirements, but by a much more abstract model of the ways in which causal forces shift and merge over time. Although the conclusions drawn by Habermas and Althusser conflict at crucial points, their mutual and essential concern with ideology and their particular interpretation of Marx's discussions of fetishism and false consciousness follow similar lines of development. Marx's specific and historically legitimate concern with consciousness and communication as parts of the capitalist labor process is transformed by Habermas and Althusser into a concept of consciousness and communication as rationalizations of the capitalist labor process, increasingly external to the process itself. Similarly, Marx's critique of a discourse devoted to the maintenance of the economic order is converted into the critique of a discourse devoted to the maintenance of superstructural forms, which now assume primary responsibility for the perpetuation of an economic order no longer able to ensure its existence through force of economic equilibrium. Both Habermas and Althusser explore the discourse of the open dialectic in a way that leads them to an appreciation of Marx and an understanding of his works unknown to the theorists of the pre-war period. But this understanding also leads them in directions that ultimately diverge from Marx's consistent concern with the history and development of capitalism as a specific and temporal mode of production. The logical extreme of the modification of breakdown theory that began with the fundamental shift in Marxist thought in the 1930s and reached its penultimate form in the works of Habermas and Althusser is found in the writings of Jean Baudrillard, a French leftist who broke from the domination of the Althusserian school. Baudrillard produced the ultimate semiological reformulation of breakdown theory in the book The Mirror of Production, first published in 1973. Here, Baudrillard sets forth the most explicit and total rejection of Marxist concepts of economic primacy yet to appear in the intellectual history of breakdown theory. Baudrillard's work represents the most radical attempt to argue that the rule of the economy is ended and political economy with it. Crises, Baudrillard argues, are no longer an economic problem, but a linguistic problem. Capitalism is threatened with imminent collapse, but through semiological rather than economic forces. Baudrillard concludes that Marx, and the entire system of thought generated by his writings, must be cast out of the minds of those who wish to understand capitalism today. In the book, The Mirror of Production, Marxist thought is not subjected to modification or mediation, but to dismissal, and breakdown theory appears in full apocalyptic form as a purely semiological affair in a capitalist society that bears little or no resemblance to the world of Marx or Lenin. The anti-productivist critique of Marx that preoccupied the members of the Frankfurt School, and the epistemological critique of Marx that preoccupied Althusser, reappear in Baudrillard as central points in his rejection of Marx's analysis of capitalism. According to Baudrillard, Marx never escaped from the conceptual boundaries of classical political economy, and consequently did not succeed in his attempt to provide the logical space necessary for an understanding of the contradictory existence of capitalism and the nature of its inevitable collapse. Baudrillard argues that Marx accepted the classical assumptions of the quote that's not the quote, sorry. Baudrillard argues that Marx accepted the classical assumption of the ontological centrality of labor, the linearity of the historical development, and the representational nature of language in a way that forced the concept of economic primacy beyond the concept of economic primacy's historically accurate and relevant context. As a result, Baudrillard claims Marx's system of thought functions in collusion with capitalist society rather than as a critique of capitalist society, and fails to comprehend the dynamics of a system torn apart by its own semiological contradictions. The concept of economic primacy, which is central to both capitalist and Marxist ideologies, Baudrillard contends is nothing more than the, quote, theorization of the rupture with symbolic exchange, end quote. Baudrillard, the reflection of a social order that is, quote, structurally incapable of liberating human potentials except as productive forces, end quote. Baudrillard. Where the hell am I? Theorists who support the concept of economic primacy from Marx to Althusser are, quote, objectively, end quote, idealist and reactionary, end quote. Baudrillard. Baudrillard argues that with the transition from competitive capitalism to monopoly capitalism, a transition that began in Marx's own era, there was also a radical change in the function of the linguistic sign. The, quote, classical era, end quote, a representational signification was lost to a new era where the signifier no longer referred back to any subjective or objective reality, but to its own logic. This transition, Baudrillard claims, constitutes a basic transformation in the nature of capitalist society and the end of the primacy of economic forces. Through this perception of a shift in the nature of capitalism, Baudrillard posits a form of breakdown theory that claims an anti-Marxist status and calls for an end to the use of Marx's capital as the fundamental text, the intellectual origin of the analysis of the contradictions of capitalism, and its ultimate fate as a social system. The, quote, epicenter of the contemporary system, end quote, Baudrillard argues, quote, is no longer the process of material production, end quote. The primary contradiction of capitalism is not economic, he claims, but symbolic, and derives from the non-reciprocity of social relations within the capitalist order. Quote, the symbolic social relation, end quote, according to Baudrillard, quote, is the uninterrupted cycle of giving and receiving, which in primitive exchange includes the consumption of the, quote, surplus, and deliberate anti-production whenever accumulation, risks breaking the reciprocity and begins to generate power. End quote. Baudrillard. Disequilibrium of power in the political realm, overtly manifested in the symbolic power of certain social groups, threatens to collapse the system and to destroy its basic premises and institutions. Baudrillard concludes that, quote, just as in 1929, when the system almost died from an inability to circulate production, so today it is perishing from an inability to circulate the spoken word, end quote. When attempts to increase participation in the political and symbolic processes fail, Baudrillard argues, capitalism will fall. The vanguard of the struggle that will hasten the collapse of capitalism consists of those who have remained outside its distorted symbolic order, women, students, and blacks. With Baudrillard, the intellectual history of Western Marxist theories of breakdown appears to reach a disjuncture in an otherwise consistent allegiance to the range of theoretical possibilities generated by Marx's capital. Baudrillard's escape from Marx, however, is not as complete as his claims indicate. The discourse of the open dialectic in Marx's Capital contains, exceeds, and ultimately defeats the central points of Baudrillard's critique of Marx. Baudrillard's rejection of Marx and his perception of the uniqueness of his own analysis are based on a selective reading of Marx's works that silences one part of the range of theoretical possibilities and exaggerates another. Baudrillard's work, then, does not constitute a rupture in the intellectual history of breakdown theory, but the last and most transparent point in a long series of attempts to reconcile Marx's theory of capitalist development with perceptions of a changing capitalist order. None of the attempts fully account for or contain the full range of theoretical possibilities generated by the original text. Instead, each duplicates or exaggerates one or several of the discourses that arise from the concepts of capital itself. But the range of theoretical possibilities generated by Marx's theory of capitalist development is expanded with each exaggeration in a way that offers an ever-increasing array of alternatives to the concepts represented in the original text. The conceptual boundaries of Marx's Capital are not situated by the works of the European theorists, but exploded into a confusing and conflicting series of perspectives on the nature of capitalism, its laws and conditions of development, and its ultimate fate as a mode of production. New section, Neo-orthodox continuations, the submerged tradition. After 1930, neo-orthodox concepts of breakdown did not disappear, but were subordinate in both quantitative and qualitative terms to the anti-orthodox interpretations that dominated theoretical work in Europe. In England and on the continent, Marxists continued to rewrite the history of capitalism in a way that revealed an allegiance to the assumption of linear causality found in the works of Kautsky and Luxemburg. These neo-orthodox Marxists drew from the concepts of underconsumption, disproportionality, and profit that had generated confusion and conflict in the debates of the Second International. Preoccupied by the same general form of analysis that had served other theorists and committed to a positivist epistemology that had become a dominant tradition in philosophy and social sciences, the neo-orthodox school of Marxist theory survived the anti-orthodox onslaught in a decidedly weakened but nonetheless influential state. In England, Marxist scholars like John Strachey believed that their neo-orthodox theories of breakdown had been verified by the Depression of the 1930s. They remained impervious to the anti-orthodox arguments. Strachey responded to the 1929 crash with a book entitled The Coming Struggle for Power, published in 1933. In this work, Strachey draws heavily from Lenin in his depiction of a, quote, new capitalism, end quote, characterized by the growth of monopolies and nationalism, and marked by economic instability and cultural decay. In this, quote, imperialist phase, end quote, of capitalist development, Strachey argues, the only future for capitalism, quote, will consist in the working out of the last possibilities of imperialism, end quote. Strachey. The Coming Struggle for Power. For Strachey, the end of capitalism is clearly in sight. Quote, when capitalism has taken on its last and most monstrous form, when commercial competition has evolved into inter-imperial war, at this very moment the conflict between the two classes in society, the workers and the capitalists, is reaching its final stage, end quote. John Strachey. The Coming Struggle for Power. Moreover, Strachey viewed the fascist movement in Europe as the capitalist, quote, last grand attempt to resist workers and external aggressors. John Strachey, The Coming Struggle for Power. The general statements on contradiction from Marx's Capital resound in this passage and throughout Strachey's early works. Once again in the history of Marxist thought, the mechanical economic collapse of capitalism, acting as an automatic stimulus, to a convulsive but unsituated class revolt appeared as the inevitable future. By 1935, Strachey had completed a lengthy manuscript on breakdown theory to support his earlier conclusions concerning the collapse of capitalism. With his expectation of imminent revolution still unfulfilled, Strachey now turned to a theory of breakdown that circumvented the issue of class struggle and relied on economic forces alone. In the book, The Nature of Capitalist Crisis, Strachey combined the notion of a falling rate of profit with underconsumption theory in an attempt to locate the critical and crucial contradiction of capitalist economic development. Drawing from Marx's law of the tendency of a falling rate of profit, and from the underconsumption theory found in Marx's discussions of periodic crises, Strachey concludes that capitalism cannot continue due to the contradictory need for both accumulation and consumption. The falling rate of profit, which Strachey claims to be a, quote, observed fact, end quote, requires an expansion of markets accomplished through imperialist policies and a contraction of wage payments accomplished through reductions in employment and the maintenance of minimal wage rates. According to Strachey, the minimization of employment levels and wage rates creates a realization problem that blocks further accumulation and ultimately offsets the expanded mass of profits. See Strachey, the book The Nature of Capitalist Crisis. The depressions of the 1930s, Strachey argues, indicates that Marx's, quote, predictions concerning the fate of capitalism are fully accurate. Although Strachey remained convinced that the breakdown of capitalism would soon occur, he no longer placed full faith in the inevitability of social revolution. In 1935, Strachey concluded that the future held two possibilities. Profit rates might be restored through increased exploitation, but the use of force required to increase exploitation would feed fascism and signal the onset of barbarism. Alternatively, economic hardship and the brutality of the fascist regimes might trigger revolution, followed by a transition to socialism. Strachey concludes in fully apocalyptic tones that, quote, the inevitable decline of civilization can only be interrupted by revolution, end quote. Strachey. 20 years later, Strachey returned to the problem of breakdown in a book written while he was a member of parliament and simply entitled Contemporary Capitalism. Capitalism had survived the depression of the 1930s that Strachey had once predicted would be its, quote, last and most monstrous form, end quote. With earlier political expectations and theoretical speculations again defeated, Strachey reformulated his ideas in a last attempt to reconcile his lifelong commitment to breakdown theory with the realities of capitalism's seeming invulnerability. Finally, Marx's thought, as Strachey understood it, was subjected to critical examination, followed by a partial and hesitating rejection. In the book, Contemporary Capitalism, Strachey's reading of Marx no longer relies on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital and the concept of a falling rate of profit, but shifts its full focus to Volume 1 and Marx's statements on revolution provoked by the increasing exploitation of the working class. Strachey argues that Marx did not believe real wages could rise under capitalism. This was Marx's, quote, fatal error, end quote. Marx did not foresee, Strachey claims, that the state, though directed through direct and indirect means, would reverse the downward trend in real wages in order to reinforce the economic system. Strachey locates the source of this, quote, error in Marx's, quote, partially deductive, anti-empirical approach, which made him believe that he had determined and defined the value of labor power as subsistence, ... End quote. Strachey. Contemporary Capitalism. The real threat to capitalism, Strachey now argues, arises from the contradiction between the desire for democratic government and the continuation of an economic structure which, with its inclination towards concentration and imperialism, is basically opposed to democracy. The future, Strachey claims, lies in democratic socialism, the inevitable victory in the, quote, coming struggle for power, end quote, that Strachey still saw as the undeniable course of history. Once again, unfulfilled expectations of mechanical collapse and spontaneous revolution prompted a turn to revisionism and reform. The resurrection of Neo-orthodoxy after 1930 spread to the continent, where Strachey's thought found its parallel in the works of Otto Bauer. In the book Between Two Wars, published in 1936, Otto Bauer produced the most sophisticated argument for underconsumption theory to appear in Marxist scholarship. Otto Bauer had studied the reproduction schemes of Marx's Capital and had argued against Luxemburg's emphasis on outside markets. Bauer combined the notion of a rising organic composition of capital, taken from profit theory, with disproportionality theory, to produce a version of underconsumptionism that linked crises to the overaccumulation of constant capital. Crises are inevitable, Bauer argues, because the accumulation of constant capital always exceeds the increase in commodity consumption that results from population growth and expanded employment. Bauer locates the primary contradiction of capitalism in the realization problem created by commodity underconsumption. Although Bauer never subscribed to a definitive concept of breakdown, those neo-orthodox theorists who came under Bauer's influence combined Bauer's unconsumptionist thesis with ideas taken from Luxemburg and Grossman to produce a new series of empirically based breakdown studies. The most successful of these studies and the most extensive defense of neo-orthodoxy in the post-war period came from Ernst Mandel, a Belgian Trotskyist who was prominent in the Fourth International. In 1962, Mandel published his two-volume Marxist economic theory, the most complete commentary on Marx's Capital to appear in the post-war years. A decade later, Mandel produced Late Capitalism, the first global treatment of capitalist development to appear in the West since Hilferding's Finance Capital, and the definitive neo-orthodox work on the, quote, new capitalism, end quote. In the book, Marxist Economic Theory, Mandel attempts to integrate his own reading of Marx with an enormous amount of empirical data on the development of capitalism since the publication of Marx's Capital. Mandel concludes that Marx's theories are still adequate and accurate, and that capitalism cannot endure the contradictions inherent in its structure as a mode of production. Mandel, however, does not offer a definitive explanation of the course of events that will lead to the collapse Mandel clearly anticipates, but suggests several scenarios with no indication of their relative probability. He discusses the role of state intervention in an economy that cannot survive crises induced by overproduction and falling profit rates unaided. At this point, Mandel seems to indicate that the most immediate threat to capitalism arises from a tendency towards long-term stagnation and inflation that the state is unable to influence. Mandel later argues that this tendency, quote, on the purely economic plane, need not lead to an automatic collapse of capitalism, end quote, but that the tendency does lead to a, quote, potential enhancement and sharpening of the class struggle, end quote. Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory. The capitalist class, according to Mandel, can respond to intensified class antagonisms through the expansion of the, quote, welfare state, or through the expansion of the, quote, fascist state, which, as Strachey had argued earlier, would reinforce falling profit rates through increased exploitation. Mandel indicates that capitalism will increasingly rely on a combination of welfare state and fascist state policies to reduce economic instability and class conflict, but that, quote, this increasing economic role of the state means at the same time the violent compression of social and international contradictions, and so intensifies the advance of capitalism towards explosive outbreaks of war and revolution. End quote. Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory. This argument eventually leads Mandel to the specter of, quote, collective destruction of nuclear war, end quote, that also haunted Strachey's works as the most probable form of collapse. The threat of nuclear war, touched off by imperialist policies and competition for markets, is a recurring theme in Mandel's works. A more sustained consideration of the development of capitalism and the potential for economic breakdown appeared 10 years later in Mandel's Late Capitalism, a book of enormous scope and scholarship. Late Capitalism, the book, attempts to reconstruct the development of capitalism since 1930, quote, within the framework of classical Marxist categories, end quote, initiated by Marx and refined by Lenin. Mandel describes, quote, late capitalism, end quote, as a distinct phase of economic development which, quote, began with fascism in the Second World War, generated a significant increase in the rate of surplus value, which was prolonged by a substantial reduction in the price of important elements of constant capital, end quote, and resulted in upward economic movement during the post-war years. Late capitalism is then a phase of development within the broader epoch of monopoly capitalism, the epoch that began at the turn of the century and was first described in Lenin's book Imperialism. Although Mandel views late capitalism as a distinct historical phase, the term, quote, in no way suggests that capitalism has changed in essence, rendering the analytical findings of Marx's Capital and Lenin's Imperialism out of date, end quote. Mandel. Late Capitalism. Mandel notes that his intention in late capitalism is to reconstruct economic history to explicate, quote, the basic laws of motion of capitalism discovered by Marx in Capital, end quote, Mandel, and, quote, to demonstrate that the, quote, abstract laws of motion of this mode of production remain operative and verifiable in and through the unfolding, quote, concrete history of contemporary capitalism, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Mandel directly addresses the unresolved problem of the relationship between the laws and conditions of capitalism. Mandel equates the, quote, abstract laws of motion, end quote, with the, quote, essence of capitalism, and argues that Marx resolved the problem of the relationship between the laws and conditions of capitalism through a dialectical mediation that Mandel describes as an oscillation between theoretical and empirical knowledge. Althusser is sharply attacked for Althusser's, quote, attempt to escape the specter of imperialism and its theory of knowledge, a specter of his own making, by establishing a basic dualism between, quote, objects of knowledge, end quote, and, quote, real objects, end quote, Mandel, and falling into idealism. This separation between, quote, objects of knowledge and, quote, real objects, end quote, led Marx to the discourse of the open dialectic and directed later Marxists to the anti-positivist position that characterizes anti-orthodox Marxist thought in the post-war period. According to Mandel, however, the separation has no foundation in Marxist thought. Moreover, he argues that this separation has stimulated misinterpretations of the tendential laws found in Marx's Capital and a subsequent diffusing of Marx's profit theory. The error of the anti-positivist position, Mandel claims, lies in its attempt to reproduce the disjuncture between, quote, appearance and, quote, essence within concrete economic reality at the epistemological level, so that theoretical knowledge and empirical knowledge exist within a similar state of disjuncture. Mandel turns to Hegel to validate his claim that, quote, the essence together with its mediations to the appearance forms a unity of abstract and concrete elements, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. According to Mandel, the dialectical method can grasp this unity in its entirety. For Mandel, then, Marx postulated a unity of opposites at the level of concrete reality and an identity of opposites at the level of conceptual understanding. This argument allows Mandel to reconstruct what Mandel refers to as the, quote, real history, end quote, of capitalism without the epistemological difficulties that Marx encountered when he rejected the Hegelian assumption of identity and voiced this rejection through the discourse of the open dialectic. According to Mandel, earlier Marxist theorists have failed to understand the, quote, development of the inevitable collapse of the capitalist mode of production, end quote, because earlier Marxist theorists have attempted to, quote, reduce this problem to a single factor. To reduce this problem to a single factor, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Mandel claims that breakdown, like any economic event, must be seen as a combination of historical forces and variables that exist in a, quote, interplay constantly articulated through the laws of development of the whole capitalist mode of production, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. The key to Mandel's concept of breakdown lies in Mandel's notion of the falling rate of profit, combined with the idea of realization problems stimulated by overproduction. Quote, fluctuations in the rate of profit are the seismograph of this history. Fluctuations in the rate of profit express most clearly the result of this interplay in accordance with the logic of a mode of production based on profit. In other words, the valorization of capital. End quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Mandel claims that, quote, late capitalism, end quote, is characterized by significant increases in the rate of surplus value and by large discrepancies between the average rate of profit and the rate of profit in monopoly sectors of the economy. Mandel argues, however, that high rates of profit in the monopoly sector do not invalidate the law of the falling rate of profit, since the constant expansion of the monopoly sector increases the organic composition of capital and eventually results in reduced profit rates in both sectors. The role of the state in late capitalism is to protect profit rates during increased monopolization by regulating currency and credit, underwriting investments, and creating additional markets. The increase in surplus value and the state's absorption of the realization costs, quote, can merely retard, end quote, the law of value and the corresponding law of profit, but cannot, quote, abolish it, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. The empirical information provided by Mandel is intended to demonstrate that monopolization and state regulation cannot circumvent the law of value. Mandel argues that if the law of value has ceased to be valid, as some theorists have claimed, then quote, contemporary society has ceased to be capitalist, end quote. A hypothesis that Mandel flatly rejects. Moreover, Mandel argues that, quote, if the, quote, regulation of the economy, end quote, by government and monopolies, is simply an attempt to deflect and temporarily attenuate, i.e. ultimately merely postpone, the effects of the law of value, then the operations of this law must inevitably prevail in the end. End quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Consequently, Mandel refuses to consider the issue of a shift in superstructural relations and argues that, quote, no arbitrary separation of the social or socio-political sphere from the economic sphere can provide a satisfactory answer to the question of the overall nature of late capitalism, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. State regulation is merely a symptom of the, quote, incurable malady, end quote, of the system. Continuation of economic crises indicates that regulations generated in the superstructure have not been and will not be able to overpower structural flaws. Mandel further argues that the state has been thwarted in its attempts, quote, to, quote, integrate, end quote, the worker into late capitalist society, end quote. Mandel. and in its attempts to, quote, divert any rebellion into reforms containable within the system, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Class conflict, then, still remains a threat to the continuation of capitalism. Quote, the essential and intrinsic consequence of the end of the long wave of post-war expansion and the intensified struggle over the rate of surplus value, unleashed from the second half of the 60s onwards, is a worldwide tendency towards qualitatively sharpened class conflicts, which will bring the endemic crisis of capitalist relations of production to explosion point. End quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. Like Strachey, Mandel remains loyal to the neo-orthodox position and impervious to the anti-orthodox concept of breakdown that dominated European Marxist thought during his lifetime. Mandel's perception of a changing capitalist reality exists within a broader perception of fundamental continuity. Although Mandel recognizes the role of state intervention, Mandel rejects the anti-orthodox perception of a reversal in the relationship between economic structure and political superstructure, and the massive theoretical and practical shifts entailed in that reversal. Mandel does not share the anti-orthodox assessment of ideological forces, or their critique of the concept of value, or their indeterminate form of breakdown theory. He has no sympathy for the anti-positivist ideology, or for their political passivity and pessimism, but at points Mandel's description of late capitalism coincides with the anti-orthodox vision. Mandel writes, quote, late capitalism is characterized by the simultaneous combination of the directly economic role of the bourgeois state, the drive to depoliticize the working class, and the myth of a technologically determined, omnipotent economy which can allegedly overcome class antagonisms, ensure uninterrupted growth, steadily raise consumption, and thereby bring forth a, quote, pluralistic, end quote, society, end quote. Mandel, Late Capitalism. The descriptive elements in both Mandel's Late Capitalism and Habermas's Legitimation Crisis form a point of overlap between the neo-orthodox and anti-orthodox positions. The radical difference between these two works, written in the same year and in the same language, are found beyond their descriptive content in their theories of knowledge and their theories of history. Despite their common vision of their common world, the irresistible present, Mandel and Habermas diverge in their thoughts about the past and the future, and in their explanatory forms, duplicating once again the diverse discourses of Marx's Capital, and exaggerating tendencies within the text they seek to clarify. Each turns away from the other, and in doing so broadens the range of theoretical possibilities arising from Marx's Capital. This range of theoretical possibilities forms the conceptual context for the works of the American Marxists who confronted the concept of breakdown in the post-war period. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of The Breakdown of Capitalism by F.R. Hansen. Thank you so much for listening. Chapter 7, the next chapter, is titled Breakdown Theory and the American Marxists, Abandonment and Retrieval in the Post-War Period. Thank you so much for listening.